podcast where we give voices to the youth of our community. My name is Jade.
My name's Maya.
Hi, I'm Dave Collins and I'm the head of the Youth Offending, Targeted Youth and Educare Service here in Luton. We're soon to be named the Youth Partnership Service because we're going to get away from labelling young people with the word offending in the title.
I'm Jess.
And I'm Ira.
Today, we will be speaking about conscious and unconscious bias, how we might even have an unconscious bias, and how conscious and unconscious bias affects us and also the youth of today. So before we start, let's have a look at this clip.
So what do you think of unconscious and conscious bias?
Unconscious bias is when you don't know you're doing it, and conscious is you know when you're doing it and you're judging someone.
So a conscious bias is someone who is judged off of the way they look or by the actions they're doing. For example, I could be walking down the road in all black hoodie, black cap, black shoes, and I could go take something out of my pocket and someone could automatically think I'm taking a knife out.
So for an example, conscious bias could be judging a person by their personality, by their attitude, and unconscious bias is when you see a random person in the street just sitting there and you just assume that they're just a beggar when they could be just chilling there.
So Ira,
Hello.
What do you think conscious and unconscious bias are?
I think it's like where if you haven't thought about someone before meeting them and you make a judgment on them before actually getting to know them, that kind of thing is one or the other. And then the other one, per se, is obviously having no preconceptions about a person and just sort of taking them as they give it to you, kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Okay, what about you?
I would say I see it as something when you look at someone and you judge them based on how you perceive them. And then the other side would be similar to Ira's, like you don't really have no judgment, you just take them how they are.
Okay.
Yeah, it's similar to these two guys. It's about your perceptions of people based on what they look like or stereotypes. You know.
Yeah.
At best, it's about judging someone and being surprised that they don't present like that, so you're able to kind of reflect and change your own behaviour. But there's a darker side to this as well, because of course you can judge people and you can discriminate against people based on what you think that they're the way they're going to act or how they look.
Yeah.
And that's when sort of unconscious bias becomes more sinister.
Okay. So for me personally, I would say that an unconscious bias is when you're not conscious of the fact that you're making that judgment, and then when it's conscious is that you already know like you don't like that group of people or that kind of person or whatever. Yeah, like I said, group of people. Yeah. So but it's more you're aware.
Decision.
Yeah, you've made the
It's
decision.
something that you've made a decision to do. Conscious bias is normally when there's normally like malicious intent with it, where unconscious is something that you're not really aware of. It's just something you've automatically just thought, like with you haven't sat there and made that decision, processed it. It's just the first thing that's come to your mind and the first thing that how you've reacted.
Yeah. So can you actually give us the actual definition of a conscious and unconscious
Okay, so
bias?
conscious bias refers to biased attitudes that you are aware of. We know we are being biased and we're doing it intentionally. And then unconscious bias it refers to biases that operate outside our awareness and our control.
Okay.
So technically, an unconscious bias isn't wrong. Neither one of them is wrong to have. Well, actually, tell a lie.
Yeah, unconscious bias is not wrong.
Unconscious bias is not wrong, but it's good to try and reform that into be a bit more positive and a bit more in a brighter light and not having these preconceptions about people.
Depends where it comes from though, doesn't it? Because you just hit the nail on the head there with preconceptions, because if you are brought up in, by parents or by society that particularly stereotypes one group or one type of person, male or female, any ethnic group, anything. And actually what you focus on with those groups is actually negative aspects of it.
Yeah.
So, what we call the kind of sort of stereotypes. Then if your unconscious bias is based on your expectation or your perception that particular group of people are going to act in that way, that's when unconscious bias, I think, becomes kind of slightly more malicious.
Yeah.
I think for me personally, I think everybody can sometimes have an unconscious bias. I think that me personally, the way that I was brought up, I had different religions within my family alone. People dating like outside of just our race, and I grew up around different kinds of people as well. Not just in school, but I had friends from different cultures. So I feel like because of that, I was able to have a better perception of people without having to have that assumption of that person's like this, or like you said, putting that stereotype on somebody just because of where they're from or who they are, or if they're male or a female, or what their lifestyle is. Do you know what I'm saying?
It's a negative stereotypes, isn't it?
So I think that it helps when you are, you know, when you do have different groups of friends or you're around different cultures, being well cultured and worldly is very good for you in terms of not having like an unconscious, well, conscious too, but an unconscious bias.
The thing is, with any kind of bias, right, I mean, it sort of taps into prejudice. So you look at prejudice, everyone holds prejudice in some way, shape or form. And I don't just mean prejudice against race, I mean prejudice against anything. You know, we all hold prejudice. Anyone who says they don't isn't being truthful with themselves. Prejudice turned into discrimination is you acting on those prejudice because of that negative stereotype or that conscious bias, unconscious bias. You know, when you find out about something about someone, when you suppose, I suppose you're going to do this, and you don't do that, and it surprises me. It's about me kind of reflecting on that and saying, oh yeah, absolutely, because you're right, actually, someone from, that's my learning. So that's what you're talking about, sort of being cultured and growing up with that. You know, so you could argue it's okay to have prejudice as long as you, one, don't discriminate, and two, you reflect on those things, because then you learn, so you're kind of almost filling your conscious bias tanks up, aren't you?
No, that's definitely a good point. It definitely, as you said earlier, it definitely stems down to sort of cultural and sort of family upbringing, because if you're brought up in a predominantly racist household per se, your views in life are going to be in the way that you've been taught, essentially. Yes, you can sort of change your views and change how you think, but if you're constantly hearing sort of discrimination from an early age, that's going to be imprinted pretty much onto your mind. And when you grow up and you then go on to have children, it's going to pass down, and that's why I think that also comes into like racism and how it will never sort of fade away because of these families and how it just cycles around and around and around.
See, I think it's a lot bigger than that. Like, I do think a part of it's your upbringing, but I also think a lot of it's obviously who you hang out with, social kind of things. Like, social media is such a big thing nowadays.
Yeah, especially in the media.
Especially when it comes to like unconscious like bias or like stuff when it's to do with like opinions, like they're massive on social media. Or just stuff based around like that, like social media or movies even. Like, movies are massive for like stereotyping people and putting like people in that sort of...
I mean, your world of influence now is kind of almost scary what young people have to face nowadays. I mean, what you were talking about in growing up in families, you're absolutely right that kind of perpetuates it. I grew up in a similar family to that, but there was always something within me, and I don't know what it was, that challenged that mentally. And so you challenge it and you want to learn. But when you look now and we think about unconscious and conscious bias, and we're talking about race, we're talking about racism, we're talking about prejudice, you think now, the world that we're kind of moving now with pronouns and the way people identify, sometimes your stereotype doesn't even apply to that person, because you could offend someone on the basis of saying something that actually you've got no knowledge about. So I think you're right to sort of say about social media, because I just think it opened up your world to so much more information and knowledge, but also ability to offend.
Especially with all these influencers as well, especially like the younger people, like following what they do, what they wear, what they eat, like all this type of stuff. Like, it's easy to lead someone into thinking a certain way.
Yeah, and that creates a lot of biases with like beauty and all that kind of stuff as well, because obviously with how they present themselves. And then obviously like certain people can get like certain opportunities because, as we've said, like because in the past, because of how they look.
And it's true, you know, and it actually makes me think. I've seen people actually literally change the way that they look. Like, even like musicians and stuff change the way they look based on the fact that they don't want that conscious or unconscious bias against them, and they want to break into the industry, so they want to look a certain way, and it's not new. If you look at, like, say for example, Toni Braxton, before she even released her album Nose Job, then now you have artists like
disclaimer there, Toni Braxton may or may not have had a nose job.
It's
JQ, did just say that Tony.
She's actually said it on interviews and stuff. So I wouldn't have said it otherwise. She said it on interviews and stuff. And she had a nose job because it actually also opened up like her singing chambers and stuff. But nose job. And then now there's an artist called Money Long. Same thing. So it's just like people want. It's. I feel like people are trying to also control how people perceive them.
See, it's funny you say that. I remember reading somewhere, and I mean, I don't have Instagram, but this kind of sort of whole idea that actually the Instagram look is something that people are kind of aspiring to, and you know, this kind of sort of idea of a larger behind, for want of not saying a word that's rude, because it's acceptable on. I mean, I wouldn't know what to call it anyway. But this idea that it's kind of almost acceptable now because of it's that to just cut that bit out.
No, you can say it. You can say it. He said,
well, I was
teaching you the new word. Said bunda.
Well, I know it's bunda because I wasn't going to say bunda. I was going to say booty, but I realised I might be 6 months out of that. But it's this idea that maybe 20 years ago it kind of people aspired, or women aspired to having smaller backsides, bunda, booty. Whereas now, because Instagram has made it kind of, body positive.
Yeah, of course.
So look at the plastic surgery on backsides.
But it's how social standards want you to conform and how they want you to be. So if you're, say, I don't know, mid-80s, 90s, it is, don't get me wrong, but when it's put into magazines, TV, it's broadcast as this petite figure that people want, you get exactly what Dave's saying. People will want to achieve that, want to strive for that. And like Instagram is now, because it is seen as luxurious to have the big behind and all these like assets, it is more desirable. It's more desirable for the younger people to want.
What do you mean by assets?
To want to strive towards that.
But do you know what the irony of all of that is when it comes to body image, and it's not even just body positivity, is that since we are talking about conscious and unconscious bias, as a black woman, we have had many conscious bias against us. We are labelled the angry black woman. We are labelled ratchet. Sometimes I'm quiet in the library reading a book. Like there are so many things. There are so many things that we are labelled as, and I don't know if you've ever heard the saying, but they say they want our rhythm but not our blues, which is that when it comes to our lifestyle, our influence, our culture, our hair, our fashion, our bodies, people are paying money to now look like what they had that conscious bias against. People are getting lip fillers, people are getting cheek fillers, people are getting Brazilian butt lifts. Not every black girl even has a big bum like that, but in terms of like stereotypically, we have that vixen shape or whatever people want to call it, or that figure eight or whatever. So it's just funny that people had that, not even an unconscious, sometimes an unconscious bias as well, but people had that conscious bias against black women, and but really now it's like they want to look like that same thing that they were so against.
But they don't get that energy back.
But they don't get, and they didn't have to go through the stuff that we had to go through either. And they put people like Sarah is it Barton? She was a I think she came from South Africa, and because she had that shape, they called her Hottentot Venus, and she was displayed. And even when she died, they displayed her body and her organs in a museum in France because of how her shape was and all of this stuff. Her organs, because of how she looked and because she was so, peculiar and haven't seen this before kind of thing. They had people in circuses and different things like that. No. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's like now for people to all of a sudden, like not just all of a sudden, it's gone over. If you look in the Victorian times, I had the padding in the hips and in the back of the dress and all of that as well. So it's something that's actually always been. That's why we say they want our rhythm but not our beliefs, because. Do you know what I'm saying? So we've had that conscious bias. I'm just taking it down the race route in terms of my experience.
Yeah, of course.
That we've had that conscious and unconscious bias against us. But everybody want to look like us. People want to get their lips filled. But they used to be like, look at your big lips.
That is a problem of the media, though. So yes, racism has always been a big thing, but when the media doesn't show the black woman with all these features, with all these assets, they don't post it in a highlight.
I'll give you a perfect example. But just before we go on to that, I just want to pick up on something you said there, because I think it's really interesting. It's like, you want all the good parts of this, but you don't want to go what I've gone through.
And I wouldn't want you to neither, but you...
No, I know, but that's such a powerful couple of words within there. Because it's like, because what you're talking about is you're talking about going through discrimination, you're going, whether that's racial discrimination, gender, stereotypical discrimination. And it's kind of, so it's okay for you to discriminate against me, hate me for these parts, but not these parts.
Yeah.
Which is the most kind of biggest bit of irony that
That's what I'm saying, it's so ironic.
You're talking about media, and given that we're kind of looking down the race, if I ask you a question, who is the face of gangs and knife crime in this country? Who is the face? Who would people immediately think of?
Black boys.
Black boys.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a thing on, because I was thinking last night, and I was thinking about just reflecting over the last couple of years, and there was a thing on BBC News last year. I think it was about October time, so it was only 8-10 months ago, and I think London was up to 68 deaths that year. And that's how they advertise it. It's BBC News as well. So remember, it's a liberal, it's not like your kind of ITV conservative whatever. It's a liberal news. And they said, and this is odds on to be one of the worst years that London's ever had. We're currently at 68 deaths. And what they flashed up on the screen was pictures of about 5 or 6 black youths. Okay, what we stereotypically, with a hood or a puffer jacket or whatever. Okay? Now I know that the majority of those murders, in London, were probably middle-aged men on their wives, because that's one of the biggest kind of sort of issues in terms of homicide anywhere really, but in London is domestic violence. But they're not reporting that. So what happens is, we're talking about these kind of racist families. So what happens, the worst case scenario is like, well, at least they're killing each other, right? Up to I don't want to be, as long as we stay away from those places, we'll be okay. It allows, that kind of reporting allows people to kind of feed their prejudice, which then feeds that unconscious bias. And then they become, we've got it in Luton. You look in Luton, now I know because I introduced myself earlier with what I do, but Luton, we have population of 260,000, 50% of kids. So that's 130,000. There's probably 50% of those that are between the ages of 10 and 18, so offending ages. So let's just say ballpark 60, 70,000 kids, right, in Luton that could any time become involved in offending. We've only got one young person in custody. Right? You go to Essex or you go to Hertfordshire and there's, countless kids in custody. We've only got one. We only had 33 kids come into the criminal justice system last year. So you tell me what a problem Luton has, because Luton almost, there's this perception of Luton, isn't there? That it's gang this and it's gang that.
All the time.
Do you remember the stabbing that made the news in the, sorry, not the Arndale, the mall?
Yes.
You've been in Luton so long you call it the Arndale.
Yeah.
I remember when it was called the Arndale.
Do you know that weekend, like, 'cause no one died in that, right? 3 kids were involved, 3 under 18s were involved in that, Obviously, I worked with kind of all 3 of them.
I had actually worked with one of them as well in the past.
That weekend,
that
weekend, a 17-year-old boy was stabbed to death in Welwyn Garden City. Do you hear about that? No, you remember the Luton thing, though, didn't you?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, it's this wonderful thing to bash Luton. Why? Why do we bash Luton? Well, why do people bash Luton?
Because it has that stereotype of gangs and knife crime and all that.
But what's so do you know what's crazy about it? And I was talking to somebody about this the other day. We moved to Luton because my mum grew up here. So my mum was born in London also, but then she went to school in Luton. Later on, years go by, whatever. My granddad was still up here with my step-nana. And Luton was actually very peaceful. More so than what it is, and I'm not saying it's not like a good place now, but it was, if you live in Luton, you know what Luton is like. We came here because where we were, there was a lot of violence, a lot of police, a lot of drugs, needles in the streets, so on and so forth. So we moved to Luton for that. But what happened is a lot of people did, and there is something where, because I've seen it for myself based on not necessarily my lifestyle, but the people I grew up around and the people I used to be around. Some people have had a certain life or worked for the Queen, and then they've come home and then they've been like, they don't want to live in their area because they want to keep out of trouble. So they actually used to come to Luton to keep out of trouble.
But then brought trouble here.
Not all the time.
Not all the time.
I feel like because some of those things happened, however, that started to
Domino effect.
Yeah, and that's where the label of Luton being associated with all these things began, because Luton never used to have that label before, you know.
But the thing is, you get people that moved out, and that kind of line is, well, Luton's a show, and it's like, well, what part? The Wardown Park, all town centres have got their own issues, but Luton's got some lovely places. We're 5 minutes away from, the sort of countryside. You go on bikes and stuff like that. But when it boils down to
Downs are actually Downs to call that.
She loves Dunstable. But what it always comes down to is it's this kind of sort of people's fear of multiculturalism, and I think that, going back to your original point, it's all about kind of media. You ask any person, who is the face of gangs, and they'll say exactly the same thing as we've said. And okay, you can't get away from it that it's predominantly young men that get involved in those kind of things. But I hate the word gangs. I hate the word knife crime, because the reality is, any of these kids that get involved in this and live under fear 24/7 a day, or are debt bonded, or these things, and I'll tell you a story about a kid in a second, which is just frightening. Given a choice, they wouldn't do that. Right? So when you've got a young person who makes a wrong choice, because 1 in 4 kids in Luton live in poverty, so living in particular areas, don't have a lot of aspirations, what are you going to do? You're going to make good choices under those conditions? Now it's us as adults and counsellors and politicians that make decisions around that. So why should I label a kid as a gang member, knife crime, the cause of all of it, because he's made a bad decision because of a decision an adult's taken? And as soon as I stop believing that, I might as well stop doing my job. Simple as that. No one would choose to live like that.
No, of course not. No one chooses poverty. No one chooses hard upbringings, and it's the situations that people find themselves in is often the cause of the problems. It's where it stems. It's their upbringing. It's a crazy world we live in, where a knife crime, if it happens, it is just another statistic. It is just added onto a tally almost, and it's not really considered about the impact that's had on their family. It's not considered,
or how to help them,
or how to help anyone in the whole situation.
That's why I continually push criminal exploitation.
What leads him to that point? Because there's loads of things around Luton, I feel, at the moment that can sort of lead in to help him.
Well, I feel like sometimes people have knives because they're scared and they're fearful. Something's going to happen to them, and then a lot of the time they get stabbed with their own knives.
It's really tough, isn't it? I mean, no doubt you've kind of sort of seen stuff like county lines and county line training, and how kids are groomed into gangs. We got this one kid, obviously no names, no pack drill, and do you know what debt bonding is?
I don't know.
Okay, so debt bonding is where you a lot of these guys that are begging on the streets, right? They're not begging, get £10 and go and buy drugs. Okay, they each day have to give 20, 30, 40 quid to a dealer. Right? So, I'm giving you this every day. If I'm short, right, I might get a belt. I might, my family friend or whatever. Sometimes you might give me drugs, but you're only giving me 20 quid's worth of drugs for the 40 quid I'm giving you every day. Because this perception that you owe money, you're debt bonded. And this kid, who's now not in Luton at this point in time, owes £40,000 to a gang. Now, he's not had £40,000 worth of stuff or anything like that. It's just that typical, it probably started off with you need to carry this from A to B, and then he got robbed. Probably by a gang member. Remember, we've all seen that.
Sent him off.
Every single time he's been arrested with possession with intent to supply, and the police have taken £1,000 of drugs, back is added to his debt. So when you're dealing with someone who's 15, 16 years old, and you're saying to that person, you need to come to this appointment because I'm going to help you, I'm going to get you in this, I'm going to get you in that. He's got a gang going, well, you owe me 40 grand. If you don't go and sell this in Norwich or there, I'm going to slash your mum's throat.
So instead of coming to where they're meant to be, they've gone to Norwich.
Your choice. Because it's kind of do whatever you want to me, but of course people's families get threatened.
Yeah.
You know, debt bonded in prison. Crazy. It's attached to. I'm told this. I don't know if this is true, but it sounds plausible that the debt is bonded to the cell. So let's say you're in prison and you take X amount of drugs or cigarettes or whatever currency from your next door neighbour in that grooming phase, but then you get moved out of that prison. The person that moves into that cell takes on that debt.
Mad.
That's what I'm being told is a new thing. And of course that debt then goes out into the community. So you think about the ways that these organised criminals are grooming kids. And remember, most of these kind of young adults, these 18 to 24-year-olds, were just exploited children themselves.
Yeah.
You know,
it's a cycle.
So if you move into a cell and you owe a debt, it's like, how are you going to pay that off? Because if you can't pay that off, I'm going to hurt you. And if you don't want to be hurt, well, you've got a younger brother.
Yeah.
Your younger brother could actually carry something. And it happens like that. It's just scary. And all at the top of it is not, you know, little sort of teenagers, 15 years old. They're not making all the money. You know, you've got these guys that are importing kilos of drugs, or these guys that, you know, you think about some of the drugs that have been confiscated by the police in Luton. They've still got the South American stamps on them.
Yeah.
So they're coming from, you know, whatever dock to this person here. And then who suffers? It's the kids that suffer.
Yeah.
And then they have to be the face of it and everything as well, like it's them. And
exactly.
Even when you said about gangs, like not every young person, even if they live a certain lifestyle and stuff, it doesn't mean that they're in a gang. Just because a group of people are even hanging around with each other doesn't mean that they're in a gang. Like it's not a gang. They're just, sometimes they're just friends. Sometimes they like what. Why is it that they never said that they're in a gang? What?
A group of kids isn't seen as a group of kids anymore.
Yeah, it's seen as a gang.
Do you know, it's such an interesting thing because part of, and I can't remember what training it was social work training or whatever, and it was along the lines of unconscious bias. We shown like a black and white picture of these kids. I think they were just stood around in all these wonderful uniforms, nice sort of beaming. It was like, what's your perception of that? Oh, you know, there's a bunch of studious kids, you know, they're all in their school uniform.
They go to Harrow on the Hill.
Well, you've been to Harrow on the Hill lately. And then they showed you another picture, which was a group of kids just like in joggers and you know, hanging around. And it was kind of, you know, the perceptions then come out about, oh, you know, well, they're in a gang, they're this, they're that. It's like, no. Both sets of kids are waiting for a bus to go to school. Yeah. And the only difference is the way the kids are dressed. Yeah. And that's your first kind of think about, you know, conscious and unconscious bias.
But even with fashion, we were talking about hood rich and stuff, and I saw a young white boy getting on the bus the other day with a hood rich backpack. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's just like, so what? When it comes to fashion and stuff like that, so what? Because it's fashionable to wear these things now, then you know you can't perceive everyone that way because it's just fashion. But when you see a young black boy wearing that, again, he's in a gang. Yeah. He's doing this. He's in that. Like, I want to know, like, how can we stop that? We spoke about obviously being well cultured and stuff as well, but how can we stop that? Because, as I said, like, there's certain people that I've been around, growing up around when I was younger, that like somebody could be an outright criminal, but I wouldn't even still treat them as such because I know that person still has a personality, that person still has feelings, that person still has emotions, that person still has a family. Like, they're still a human being, and like you said, they just made change. And they can change. It's just that they made a bad decision at the time. So I would never treat somebody a certain way unless I thought, oh my god, that person's like a threat to me. Like, I'm not going to treat somebody a certain way just because of a bad decision. They're already probably beating themselves up about it as well.
It's what bad world we would live in if we can't kind of sort of change after making bad decisions, or we can't forgive after making bad decisions. And that's the way I approach my work with young people that we work with. And I know, because I mean I met someone yesterday who when I used to work with young people and I was a practitioner, I used to write pre-sentence reports. That's where you write a report for someone to kind of sort of, you know, their home circumstances, but you suggest to the court what that sentence should be, and you know you hope that the judges. And I mean, he's not a kid anymore. He's like 38 years old, which made me feel really old. And I met him yesterday. I hadn't seen him since I'd written his pre-sentence report in 2004. And he's like, just remember, he's like a grown man. Yeah. And he's like, Dave, I got a job. I'm like, you know, I'm a chef at the airport, and it's all. And it just made me feel great. He was a nightmare when he was 16. But it's just so good to see him because, you know, like live and work in Luton and have done for 20 odd years with people. I see a lot of people. And, you know, for every kind of negative thing I see sort of positive things as well. And you said earlier, you know, how do we do it? How do we change these things? And what we do is we change it by, you know, continually being those people that challenge people. So I challenge people all the time. And, you know, I asked you the question about sort of gangs. I asked that of groups of staff. You know, I asked that as part of our interview process. You know, because I want to know what someone is saying. So, you know, in our interview process...
And what they're not saying too.
Well, exactly. And I always say, give me an example of prejudice. You know, what prejudice do you have? Oh, I don't have any. Really? Okay. You know, and you start picking that apart.
Red flag,
exactly what it does. Kind of straight away, you know, you want someone that's going to be able to learn and be reflective. So what you do is you feed it back. You know, for every kid that commits an offence, right, there's 60, 70, 80, 90 kids in Luton learning instruments, sports, diving, swimming, all of these things. We don't talk about that. Why? You know, go to Inspire on a Tuesday and Thursday night, you see these kids diving off of like 25 These kids are like this big, right? They are amazing.
Yeah.
No one talks about them.
Yeah, and I think that they ought to be celebrated because I think that if they were celebrated, that would actually also make a difference to other young people because they'll actually see people that look like them or that are, in terms of not just race but in terms of age group and stuff as well.
Exactly.
To be like, oh, that person does that and that's cool to do as well. It's cool to be successful. It's cool to have a future because when you live a certain lifestyle you're not going to be able to see that. Well, I think that it does start at home and I feel like parents, whether you can afford it or not, I know that obviously sometimes there's poverty and you can't really, you know, afford for your children to do certain things. But I feel like anything is possible when it comes to, I guess, feeding your child's mind. Even if you are just sitting down and talking to them and educating them. If you can't take them to certain classes or whatever it might be, there's a way. Sometimes there are things that might be free or there might be opportunities. There's a lot of opportunities out here that have funding for young people to actually do things to better themselves that they don't have to pay for. Some places obviously still have to pay for private classes and stuff, but some people do offer things that are for the community that they get funding for where they're able to contribute
as part of the youth servicing, we do loads of things in the community through something what I call the Tree Project, which is tackling, reducing, ending exploitation. When lockdown first happened, you know, March 2020, and the kind of streets were empty, it was like, oh right, so exploitation's gone, offending's gone. It didn't. It went into like little dark corners. And it wasn't kind of sort of there and then. And I managed to get some emergency COVID funding to set up this tree project, which has continued since then. You know, and I look at the tree project now, and it works in sort of key areas. This Dallow is going to be a feature of this summer. But you know, looking over in Lucy Farm, so I work with a community organisation over there, Chance to Change, who've got the kind of community buy-in, and we run classes there that are accredited with guaranteed places in Barnfield as a result of doing these things.
That's really good, yeah.
But that's all been developed through this kind of chance. Just I'm sat there in a meeting, someone said, oh yeah, £60 million of COVID fund. What, for who? £60 million, you say, where will we get that from? And you know, and I got 90 odd thousand pounds for it and just got funding ever since then. So there are things for young people to do, but going back to what you said about children growing up in families that kind of perpetuate this kind of sort of discrimination, it's a line that I've never ever forgotten from probation training, because you can't change someone. You cannot change someone. All you can do is present them with the opportunities to realise that change and change themselves. Probation, it's called sowing the seed of dissonance and watching that grow. But that's what you do with kids. So you know, you're talking about seeing someone diving or playing musical instruments or whatever. That's sowing that seed of dissonance with someone. And it's, you know, I think where my world fails with young people is they like to put them in boxes. Right, you've committed an offence, you need to now do this to stay out of custody, and I need you to do that. And that kid's like, well, I'm not going to do that because I'm still tied in with this and this. You can't, sometimes what you see as the kind of final version isn't. It's like people who use drugs. If you say to someone who's on the street, you need to stop using drugs. Okay, well, no, you need to take away this trauma, and then I'll stop using drugs. You know, it's kind of, you don't see what the...
You need to give them the opportunities to actually... You need to show them opportunity first before, you know, you start to try and put all of these things and just change. You can't just change somebody's life. You have to they have to unlearn a lot of things and rewire their brain first before...
Not even unlearn, I'll just say rethink a lot of
that's why because sometimes it is unlearning though, because sometimes you have a certain defense mechanism for something that leads on to that, or sometimes you have a way of dealing with certain situations, and it's like, actually I don't have to actually that's not the way to deal with that, and there are many other ways to deal with this trauma. For example, I can go to therapy, or like I can go to CBT, or there's wellbeing, or I can go to the gym, or there are so many different things and different ways that I can actually handle this, as opposed to doing X, Y, and Z, because really I feel like dealing with the root of the issue is what takes away from people then not having anything to say when it comes to conscious or unconscious bias, because these are the core things that are being tackled. That's not to say that it's right. It isn't right. So something that actually happened that contributes to people having a conscious or unconscious bias is the fact that an Olympic sprinter, Bianca Williams, was actually stopped by the police. So here's the clip of that incident.
A video already viral. The distress in Bianca Williams' voice clear.
He didn't do anything!
First, when her partner was taken out of the car and handcuffed by police.
My son is in the car!
And then as she was forced out of the back and away from her 3-month-old baby. The couple deny police claims that they were driving suspiciously.
I've never been in that situation before, and to be in that front line along with my son, it was just awful.
So as you can see, Bianca was stopped by the police and was racially profiled, and I feel like that's something that is usually not often highlighted in the UK compared to in the States. It also shows that people in the police force, who shouldn't really have any form of bias because they're here to protect and serve, are actually having both a conscious and unconscious bias. And you can see it by the way that they treat people of colour, or by the way that they treat people that look a certain way. So what do you guys think about that? Because I think that it's something that's actually happening, but nobody's not really... I don't feel like it's highlighted as much. Like, I saw that on social media. I didn't see it on the news.
No, I saw that a while back as well. But I think it's sort of... In America, it's always... There's a possibility of it being lethal. There's always... In the stop and search, there's always a possibility that this person could lose their life. And that's just based on how the American policing runs, or how they do their things over there. I'm not one to say on how it's done.
It does happen over here too.
It does. And obviously, there was a case a while back where a woman was arrested and she was beaten to death in her cells, or something along them lines. And yes, it does happen here, but it's not highlighted in the same way, because the police don't have the lawful use of firearms and everything like this. It's not as immediate. It's not as, okay, you commit the crime, shot on the scene, done. It's a longer process. That's why I think it's more scary here, because you don't know anyone's intent. You could go to jail 1 minute and find yourself beaten up in the cell, and then just have to be like, oh yeah, it happened. No one's going to believe you because we're in the UK. That doesn't happen. Do you know what I mean?
I do feel like it's shown a lot in America though, but not a lot is shown in the UK. Like, I don't hear a lot about this kind of stuff in the UK, but I know on like social media, it's a lot on there and a lot happening, but no one really has to explain any of their actions like most of them do in America.
It's kind of system-wide in America, I think, is what you're describing. I think over here, and because I've been in criminal justice for such a long time, I remember specific examples, you know, whether it's Stephen Lawrence, that was like a kind of inquest into the behaviour of the Met Police, or, you know, and I can't for the life of me remember his name, but it was a Brazilian tourist that was shot dead as a result of a potential, I think it was a potential terrorist kind of investigation at the time. And it's kind of almost like this happens in this country, but it's compartmentalised. I mean, you think about what kind of Muslims went through during the kind of real height of ISIS, with Islamophobia and kind of almost like sort of profiling of our sort of South Asian residents who are kind of almost being profiled in light of the behaviour of kind of ISIS.
Yeah.
It's always existed, and there's inquests into it. You know, there's deaths in custody. You know, in Bedfordshire of you know, people of colour with mental health, and it becomes an inquest. To me, and I don't know whether this is just being cynical, we never seem to build on it. You know, there's an inquest, and the inquest makes recommendations, and then they kind of move on. That's why I don't know if you guys know, but the Met Police are currently under special measures now for some of their actions. It's worth looking into, because when, you know, an inspectorate puts a whole police force, particularly a police force like the Met, into special measures, you know, that's a serious thing.
Yeah.
But when you look at stop and search, if we are saying that young people carrying knives should not be viewed as perpetrators, they should be portrayed as victims of criminal exploitation, and stop and search should be a safeguarding process. Now, you can't do that overnight. So I'm not saying, right, so actually, do you know, you're not profiling now, you are doing a safeguarding thing. But if we couch it in that, in safeguarding, which means that we don't then arrest that young person or prosecute that young person or charge that young person, you know, in a few years' time, it's seen as this safeguarding process. When it's not, then
we've also met somebody that actually is part of like the committee that actually sit down with stuff. We know that there are things in place where it's like, okay, on this, for example, you shouldn't have handled it this way, you should have handled it that way. So that really contributes as well. To summarise, I think personally, from my viewpoint, I feel like one of the things that we can do to tackle, you know, conscious and unconscious bias together actually is educating young people on different cultures, different backgrounds, bringing them around different people and stuff, so that they don't just have that stereotype against
I think
those kind of people.
calling it out as well, like not being afraid to
challenge
it doesn't have not being afraid to challenge it, not being afraid to talk about it, it being like a discussion. It doesn't have to be heated, it can just be an open discussion.
Yeah. Thank you much so guys for watching it again. We look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.